So today we're going to host Andrew Lee. Andrew is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo and is affiliated with the ConsciousBrainConcepts consortium. Andrew got his PhD in 2019 from New York University, where he worked with David Chalmers, Ned Block, and Thomas Nagel, and was a postdoctoral research fellow at Rice University prior to coming here at Oslo. So Andrew is particularly interested in questions about how conscious experience are structured and how to formally model that structure and the ethical significance of consciousness. But today he is here to discuss whether consciousness come in degrees, or what does it mean to have more or less consciousness, if such a thing is possible. So over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming here. So this is going to be a talk about the idea of degrees of consciousness. And the main question that I'm going to be interested in is whether consciousness comes in degrees. If the answer here is yes, then that means that some creatures or mental states are more conscious than other creatures or mental states. And if the answer is no, then that means that these kinds of claims are either false or incoherent. Now, if you look at the consciousness literature, then you'll see two very different perspectives on this question. You'll see some people say, yes, that actually it's an obvious datum that consciousness comes in degrees. And those who favor this perspective will say things like, a human is more conscious than a fish, a walrus more conscious than a rock, an awake person more conscious than a drowsy person, an intense pain more conscious than a mild pain, a vivid perception more conscious than a mental image, or a psychedelic experience more conscious than a sober experience. On the other hand, there's some people who think the answer is no, that the idea that consciousness comes in degrees is conceptually confused. And the most popular objection, the most influential objection that has persuaded a lot of people towards this perspective is what I'll call the determinacy objection. That's the objection that says an entity either is conscious or not. There is no middle ground. Even if an entity has only a sliver of feeling, that entity still counts as conscious. So therefore, it doesn't make sense to say that consciousness comes in degrees. Now, there's a whole lot of literature that falls within this first perspective. This is just a sample of papers that I found that explicitly express sympathy towards the idea that consciousness comes in degrees. And you'll see from the sample that this spans several decades. It includes philosophers and scientists. And it includes both theoretical and empirical work. For the second perspective, it's mostly a number of philosophers who have argued that this idea of degrees of consciousness is conceptually confused. And by far the most influential paper in this perspective is a paper by Bain, Hoey, and Owen called Are There Levels of Consciousness? Where they say the notion of degrees of consciousness is of dubious coherence. According to the standard conception of consciousness, a creature is conscious if and only if it possesses a subjective point of view. Arguably, the property of having a subjective point of view is not gradable. It cannot come in degrees. And there's a number of other philosophers who have expressed similar things, but this has been the most impactful paper. It's been very widely cited since it's come out. And if you look at any discussion of degrees of consciousness, whether in favor or against, since then, this paper is usually cited. Now, this question matters a lot because, I mean, those who favor the idea of degrees of consciousness have thought that it can be used as a basis for constructing empirical measures of consciousness or as a constraint on mapping the structure of consciousness, or even as a fundamental axiom for a theory of consciousness. Whereas those who are against think that, no, these claims are confused. So what that means is that whether consciousness comes in degrees, which answer is correct, really matters for both the philosophy and the science. If the answer is yes, then any theory of consciousness ought to capture its degreed structure, and any empirical measure of consciousness ought to be graded rather than binary. If the answer is no, then that means a great deal of consciousness research is fundamentally confused, including that gigantic list of articles that I had on the other slide. So that's why I'm interested in this issue. I think that this is a topic that is of interest for anybody working in consciousness research. And what I'm going to try to do in this talk is to make some progress on this question. So you might wonder, where do I fall on the spectrum? To some extent, I think that both perspectives are getting some things wrong. So against the no perspective, I don't think there's any philosophical objection against degrees of consciousness that's compelling. I think that the idea of degrees of consciousness is perfectly coherent, and I'm going to spend a good amount of this talk explaining why that's the case. But then against the yes perspective, I don't think that we can simply take the idea of degrees of consciousness for granted. I don't think that any of those claims that I mentioned earlier, that humans are more conscious than fish, or psychedelic experiences more conscious than sober experiences, I don't think any of those claims are entirely obvious. I think that instead, rather than taking degrees of consciousness for granted and building a theory out of it, what we should do instead is look at different theories of consciousness and ask which of these entail that consciousness comes in degrees. One of the basic ideas that I'm going to advocate for is that what it is to be more conscious is to have more of whatever consciousness is. And we don't know what consciousness is yet. So we don't know yet whether some creatures can be more conscious than others. But I'm also going to argue at the end that I think that on most ways of thinking about what consciousness is, on most theories of consciousness, it's actually going to turn out that consciousness comes in degrees. And given that, I think that maybe the most interesting question at the end of the day isn't going to be whether consciousness comes in degrees, but instead which degreed features of consciousness count as degrees of consciousness. So that's where I'm eventually going to go. Here's the structure of the talk. First, I'll make some basic clarifications about what I mean by degrees of consciousness. Then I'll discuss the determinacy objection against degrees of consciousness and argue that the determinacy objection doesn't work. Then I'll develop a positive analysis of degrees of consciousness, of what it would take for consciousness to come in degrees. And then I'll apply that analysis to a few different theories of consciousness. So first, let's give a name to the idea that consciousness comes in degrees. I'll just call this the degrees thesis for the rest of the talk. And the degrees thesis I take to be basically equivalent to the following claims. So to say that consciousness comes in degrees is to say that some entities are more conscious than others, that consciousness comes in greater or lesser extents, that there are levels of consciousness, that consciousness is graded, that there are magnitudes of consciousness, or in maybe more philosophically technical terms, that consciousness is a naturally orderable, determinable property. Okay, that's all well and good. What's more important, I think, is to distinguish the degrees thesis from some other claims that it's often confused with. So the degrees thesis is not equivalent to the following claims. First, the degrees thesis is a claim about phenomenal consciousness. It's not a claim about other forms of consciousness. And this is important because if you look in the consciousness literature, you'll oftentimes see people say things like, of course, consciousness comes in degrees. A fully awake person is more conscious than a sleeping person. But here, it's not clear that what's being talked about is phenomenal consciousness. Maybe what's being talked about is wakefulness. It's obvious that wakefulness comes in degrees. Nobody can contest that. But it's not obvious that a fully awake person is more phenomenally conscious than, say, a drowsy person. So the interesting degrees thesis, the thing that I'm talking about, is a claim about phenomenal consciousness. Now, we should also distinguish the claim that consciousness comes in degrees from the claim that some features of consciousness come in degrees, features like intensity, vivacity, precision, or complexity. And this is also important because sometimes people say that, of course, consciousness comes in degrees. For example, some experiences are more intense than others. Some experiences are more precise than others. But it's not obvious that these degreed features are really degrees of consciousness. I mean, everybody can accept that some features of consciousness come in degrees, but what's not obvious is whether consciousness itself comes in degrees. I'll say more later on how we can disentangle these things. Third, sometimes people assume that the degrees thesis entails a principle that's sometimes called comparability. That's the claim that for any x and y, either x is more conscious than y, or y is more conscious than x, or they're equally conscious. But not all degreed properties satisfy comparability. So think about size, for example. It's not the case that for any two objects, one is either bigger than the other or they're equally big. It might be that one object is bigger with respect to height and the other with respect to width. And it's not quite correct to say that either is bigger than the other or that they're the exact same size. They're just not comparable. But it's still obviously the case that size comes in degrees. So maybe consciousness will turn out to be like that. Maybe in some cases, we can say maybe it'll turn out that humans are more conscious than fish, but when we compare humans and octopuses, neither is strictly more conscious than the other. And then last, sometimes people characterize the idea that consciousness comes in degrees as the claim that consciousness is a continuous quantity. But you don't need to think that degrees of consciousness have a continuous structure. Degrees just requires ordinal structure and ordering. In fact, just a partial ordering. It doesn't require anything like continuity. That's the kind of thing that you'll study in like calculus or topology. So here's an example. Imagine a light dimmer that has 10 different brightness settings, and where the jump from one brightness setting to the next doesn't always involve the same amount of change in luminosity. So in this case, the brightness values enabled by the light dimmer come in degrees. They can be brighter or less bright, but the degrees aren't continuous. Instead, they're discrete. Another dissociation is hue. So hue is an example of a property that could be continuous. Maybe it has a continuous structure, but it's definitely not degreed. One thing can't be greater in hue than another. So questions about degrees are just independent from questions about continuity. Okay, that's a pretty brief overview of these distinctions. There's more that could be said for each of them, but I wanted to go through them quickly. And that's mostly because I wanted to spend most of my time on a more subtle distinction. And that brings us to the next part of the talk, the determinacy objection. So again, the determinacy objection is the main philosophical objection that has been made against degrees of consciousness. This is the objection that's been invoked by some philosophers who have said that all you scientists, and some philosophers too, talking about degrees of consciousness are confused. And again, the objection goes like this. An entity either is conscious or not. There is no middle ground. Even if an entity has only a sliver of feeling, that entity still counts as conscious. So it doesn't make sense to say that consciousness comes in degrees. And I mentioned this paper by Bain, Hoey, and Owen at the beginning. Are there levels of consciousness? Here's a passage from their paper that is characterizing the target of their criticism. They say, this idea of degrees of consciousness is frequently expressed in consciousness science. For example, consciousness is described as involving a scale ranging from total unconsciousness to vivid wakefulness as a continuous variable and as being graded rather than being an all or none property. Are these claims plausible? Can individuals be ordered on the basis of how conscious they are? And then they go on and present their main criticism. This is the passage that we saw earlier. They say the notion of degrees of consciousness is of dubious coherence. A creature is conscious if and only if it possesses a subjective point of view. That's not gradable. It can't come in degrees. Okay. Now, I think that this objection feels fairly compelling initially. In fact, when I first read this paper, I found it quite convincing. But then when I thought about it more, I realized this objection can't work. There must be something wrong with this objection. And the reason for that is that we can construct structurally analogous arguments that lead to obviously false conclusions. So here's an example. On the left, I have the determinacy objection against degrees of consciousness that we saw earlier. And on the right, there's another version of a determinacy argument against degrees of size that's structurally analogous. So this says an entity either has size or not. There is no middle ground. Even if an entity occupies only a tiny region of space, that entity still counts as having size. Therefore, it doesn't make sense to say that size comes in degrees. So the idea is that everything either has size or not. You have size, I have size, Norway has size. The number 3 doesn't have size, or at least not physical size. The color red doesn't have size. Love doesn't have size. So everything either has size or not. So size doesn't come in degrees. Now, obviously, that's a bad argument. Obviously, size does come in degrees, but this argument is structurally analogous to the argument against degrees of consciousness. So if this argument against degrees of size is fallacious, then the argument against degrees of consciousness must be fallacious. And you can see pretty easily that we could construct similar bad arguments using mass or velocity or temperature or other examples of degree properties. So what's gone wrong? What's the problem with this argument? Here's my diagnosis. I think the problem comes from confusing questions about degrees. Does consciousness come in degrees? From questions about indeterminacy. Can it be a matter of degree whether some entity is conscious? And one way to disentangle these two things is to just look at how they come apart in particular examples. So first, think about mass. Mass is a property that's degreed, but it's always determinate whether something has mass. It's not a matter of degree whether something has mass. Something either has mass or doesn't, but mass comes in degrees. Something can have more mass than another thing. On the other hand, think about something like the property being a quark. It's not a matter of degree whether something is a quark. Everything either is or isn't. There is no middle ground. But quarkhood doesn't come in degrees. One thing can't be more quark than another thing. For a property that's degreed, but where there can be indeterminacy, think about warmness. So it's a matter of degree whether something is warm. Lukewarm is borderline warm. And warmness comes in degrees. Something can be warmer than another. And then finally, think as an example of a property that's dichotomous, meaning not degreed, and that allows for indeterminacy. Think about the property of being a tree. It's a matter of degree whether something is a tree. Consider any Sorites case, or just think about like the gradual process from a seed to an actual tree. But treehood doesn't come in degrees. One thing can't be more tree than another thing. So these are two different dimensions, and there's dissociations in all these cases. We can fill in each of the boxes in this two-dimensional grid. And what that indicates is that questions about degrees are different from questions about indeterminacy. Here's another way of thinking about it. Questions about indeterminacy concern membership within categories, whereas questions about degrees concern the values of magnitudes. Now, if membership within a category itself has a degreed structure, then both kinds of questions are going to concern degreed structures. But the difference is that in cases of indeterminacy, the degrees characterize the extent to which something has a property, whereas when we're talking about degree properties, the degrees characterize the structure of the property itself. Another way of disentangling these things is to think about the semantics. So in general, we can distinguish the property of being an F or having F from the property F itself, where F is a candidate property. So in other words, properties like having mass or being warm are different from properties like mass and warmth. We denote the former using gerund phrases, having mass, and the latter using noun phrases, mass. And what's going on with the determinacy objection is that it's drawing upon the intuition that being conscious doesn't come in degrees, but that's compatible with consciousness coming in degrees. So think about how having mass doesn't come in degrees, even though mass itself comes in degrees. So this gives us a diagnosis of what's going on with the determinacy objection. All it shows is that it's not a matter of degree whether something is conscious, but that's compatible with consciousness coming in degrees. Now, some people might see this and think, well, isn't this all just a little bit too nitpicky? Why couldn't we just say that the sentence consciousness comes in degrees is ambiguous? Maybe one fair interpretation is that it means that consciousness comes in greater or lesser extents. Another fair interpretation is that it can be a matter of degree. There's borderline cases of consciousness. Now, one thing is, I think that this response is just incorrect about the semantics once we think carefully about it. But set that aside, because I think that even if this were the correct interpretation of the semantics, I don't think that would affect my core points. Because here's the thing, if you just look in the consciousness literature, you'll see a lot of confusion between these two ideas. Some work that talks of degrees of consciousness is focused on indeterminacy. Other work that talks of degrees of consciousness is focused on degrees. And that wouldn't be a problem if the literatures themselves were appropriately divided, but that's not the case. Instead, articles that are on one issue draw upon or criticize arguments that are about the other, usually without any indication that these are two distinct, independent issues. And in most cases, the terms degrees and indeterminacy are just treated interchangeably, which leaves it unclear which issue is really at stake and unobvious which arguments are relevant. So just to drive home the point, let's look at one more example of a author who is making arguments about indeterminacy but drawing conclusions about degrees. So there's a recent book by Peter Carruthers called Humans and Animal Minds, the Consciousness Questions Laid to Rest. And this has also been fairly impactful. And one of the central theses in this book is that consciousness is all or nothing. So you might see that and wonder, okay, what does that mean exactly? That's certainly ambiguous between a claim about degrees and a claim about indeterminacy. Well, if you look carefully, you'll see that Carruthers elaborates this thesis by saying either a mental state is like something for its subject to undergo, or it's not. Phenomenal consciousness is either categorically present or categorically absent. And phenomenal concepts are sharp rather than vague. So these claims are clearly about indeterminacy. And he gives arguments for them, and we might think, okay, these arguments are compelling. These seem to show that there are no borderline cases of consciousness. But then the issue is that there are inferences that are made to conclusions about degrees. Carruthers says we can't make sense of degrees of phenomenal consciousness, that it's incoherent to say that a bee is to some small degree phenomenally conscious, or that they're conscious to some small extent. And he takes theories that entail the degrees thesis, like integrated information theory, to be philosophically untenable because they entail the degrees thesis. And the problem here is that these statements may or may not be true, but they don't follow from the statements about indeterminacy. So whether or not we think that consciousness has borderline cases, we shouldn't infer from that there's no coherent notion of degrees of consciousness. And I mean, I'm looking closely at Carruthers here, but he's just one example. There's plenty of other cases where similar sorts of inferences are made. Okay, so that's my first big point, that questions about degrees are distinct from questions about indeterminacy. If we're asking, does consciousness come in greater or lesser extents, that's not the same as the question of whether there are borderline cases of consciousness. So this is all just defending the coherence of degrees of consciousness. I haven't yet said anything in favor of thinking that consciousness does in fact come in degrees. And in fact, it's still not really clear from everything that I've said what exactly it would take for consciousness to come in degrees. So let me address that next. Now I'll move to my analysis of degrees of consciousness. So here's the question that we're interested in now. What does it take for consciousness to come in degrees? And there's two different strategies that you might pursue in answering this question. One strategy is to ask, what does it take in general for a property to come in degrees? I don't think this strategy is very promising though. One reason is because if we pursue the strategy, then we're likely to get entangled in fairly abstruse issues in metaphysics and the philosophy of science. And more importantly, I don't think that answering this abstract question would actually yield a verdict on our target question about consciousness. And that's because in most cases, to figure out whether a property comes in degrees, we have to look at the nature of that property rather than at the nature of degrees. But I think there's another strategy that's more promising. Instead of asking what it takes for any property to come in degrees, we should ask, what does it take for a given degree property to count as degree of consciousness? Let's call that property phi. Let's say that phi is a property that comes in degrees. We're asking, under what conditions can we say that phi is degree of consciousness? That's what I'm going to focus on in what follows. And at the bottom, I'll just keep the reminder, phi is a degree property that's a candidate for degree of consciousness. And then I'll use the notation phi of x to denote the degree of X with respect to phi. Okay, so how do we go about answering this question? Here's one starting point. Here's an observation. If consciousness comes in degrees, then differences in degrees of consciousness should entail differences in phenomenology. That seems very intuitive, right? If that weren't the case, then it would be unclear why the relevant degree property should count as degrees of consciousness rather than degrees of something else. So suppose then that phi is a degree property and that we wish to know whether phi is degrees of consciousness. Then we can ask, is it possible for there to be two subjects that are phenomenal duplicates, yet that differ in their phi values? If that is possible, then we can rule out phi as a candidate for degree of consciousness. This idea can be precisified into what I call the difference criterion. So the difference criterion says that if phi is to count as degree of consciousness, then it has to be the case that if X's phi value is different from Y's phi value, then what it's like to be X is different from what it's like to be Y. Okay, so far so good. Now we have one condition for what it takes for consciousness to come in degrees. Here's another observation. If consciousness comes in degrees, then greater differences in degrees of consciousness should entail greater degrees of dissimilarity with respect to some dimension of consciousness. So in other words, if there's no aspect of phenomenology that phi corresponds to, then that can't be degrees of consciousness. That must be just some degree property that, you know, is associated with consciousness somehow. But if whatever degrees of consciousness are, it has to make for some kind of systematic variation in phenomenology. That's what I mean by degrees of similarity with respect to some phenomenal dimension. Now, it's a little bit more tricky to formulate this into a principle, but I think the right way of doing this that makes this criterion independent from the difference criterion is that if we have three entities, X, Y, and Z, and X's phi value is greater than Y's phi value, which is greater than Z's phi value, then it must be the case that what it's like to be X is more similar along some phenomenal dimension to what it's like to be Y than what it's like to be Z. Okay, this too, I think, is very intuitive. You know, this is being stated in some slightly fancy philosophical language, but all it's really saying is that if consciousness comes in degrees, then there's some aspect of phenomenology that degrees of consciousness tracks. So now we have two criteria, the difference criterion and the dimension criterion. And I think we only need one more criterion to have an analysis of degrees of consciousness. But I think this last criterion is a little bit more, takes a little bit more work to identify. So first, let me take a step back and ask a more general question. The more general question is, what's the relationship between degrees of some property F and being F? So for any degree property F, there's always going to be a corresponding dichotomous property, being F. So think about mass and having mass. So being F or having F. And whenever we have a degree property, we can ask what exactly is the relationship between degrees of F and being F? How much of a degree of F do you need in order to count as being F? And there's different answers in different cases. So for example, think about mass. In order for something to have mass, it just has to have any positive degree of mass. Even if something has just a little bit of mass, it still counts as having mass. So mass is what I call a minimal degree property. It's a property where X has that property, something has that property, just in case it has a positive degree of that property. There's other cases though. For example, think about straightness as in the opposite of bentness. It's reasonable to think that in order for something to be straight, it has to be perfectly straight. Even if something is just a little bit bent, then it doesn't count as straight. So straightness is an example of a maximal property. In order for something to be straight, it has to have a maximal degree of straightness. Any less makes it bent rather than straight. There's also properties like warmness, where you just need some intermediate value. So you don't need you need something more than just a minimal degree of warmness to count as warm. But you don't need maximal warmness. For example, 30 degrees is warm, but it's not as warm as 40 degrees. And then finally, there's properties that I call universal, for example, charge. As long as anything has a charge value, whether positive, negative, or zero, it counts as having charge. Okay, so there's these different kinds of relationships between degrees of a property and being or having that property. So we can ask, where does consciousness lie in this taxonomy? And I think it's pretty plausible and pretty easy to see that consciousness is a minimal property. So even if there's barely something it's like to be an entity, even if an entity has just a sliver of feeling, that entity still counts as conscious. At least on the assumption that consciousness comes in degrees. So that means that we can rule out the medial and maximal options. But then for the universal option, well, it doesn't really make sense to talk about negative degrees of consciousness. At least I'm not really sure how to interpret that. And it's also plausible that an entity that's conscious to degree 0 is conscious simpliciter. So I think that we can rule out the universal option. So in other words, if consciousness comes in degrees, then we should think that it's a minimal degree property. It's a property such that anything with a positive degree of consciousness is conscious. And that brings us to the third criterion in the analysis. Here's the third observation. If consciousness comes in degrees, then consciousness is a minimal degree property, meaning anything with a positive degree of consciousness counts as conscious. The more precise criterion is what I call the threshold criterion. An entity is conscious if and only if it has a positive phi value. That's a condition on phi counting as degree of consciousness. So let's put this all together. We were starting with the question, what does it take for a given degree property phi to count as degree of consciousness? And I've now articulated 3 different criteria. The difference criterion. Differences in phi have to entail differences in phenomenology. The dimension criterion, phi corresponds to some phenomenal dimension. And the threshold criterion, an entity is conscious if and only if it has a positive phi value. Now, I think this is almost right. I think we're almost there for an analysis, a proper analysis of degrees of consciousness. But I think there's still one difficulty. I'm not going to talk too much about this difficulty because just for purposes of time and to not get too much into the details of analytic metaphysics. But here's the problem. How do we disentangle degreed features of consciousness, like intensity, vivacity, and so forth, from degrees of consciousness itself? I mentioned this problem earlier. And I think this is one of the principal difficulties for assessing whether consciousness comes in degrees. Because everybody agrees that some features of consciousness come in degrees, but are any of those degrees of consciousness itself? And in fact, this problem is particularly difficult if you think that there are some features, maybe intensity or vivacity, for example, that are had by any conscious experience. Maybe every conscious experience has some degree of intensity or some degree of vivacity. But does that mean that intensity and vivacity should automatically count as degree of consciousness? I'm inclined to think no. It seems to me like that would be too liberal of a characterization of degree of consciousness. It seems like in order for there to be something that we can properly call degree of consciousness, it has to be there has to be more than just that. Now, I think there's a solution. As I said, I'm not going to talk much about the solution. I'll just say, I think the right way of solving this problem is to distinguish between properties that are part of the nature of consciousness from properties that are merely necessarily co-instantiated with consciousness. And I think that we can fix this by basically replacing the if and only if operator in the threshold criterion with this other operator, which you might call a metaphysical analysis operator or a real definition operator or a generalized identity operator. Basically, this is saying that what it is for something to be conscious is for it to have a positive phi value. That's how you should read the current version of the threshold criterion. It's saying that phi has something to do with the nature of consciousness. It's not merely co-instantiated with consciousness. And again, there's more that could be said to explain this and spell this out and justify it. But to move forward, I'll just say I think this is the right analysis of degrees of consciousness. And with that, I think we have an answer to the question that we started with. A degreed property phi counts as degree of consciousness if and only if differences in phi entail differences in phenomenology. Phi corresponds to some phenomenal dimension. It tracks some aspect of phenomenal similarity. And if what it is for an entity to be conscious is for it to have a positive phi value, that's the analysis that I'm offering. And this analysis, there's 3 different parts to it. It's not something that you can just spout off. And there's some complexity there. But I think that the basic idea behind this analysis, the basic principle that's guiding all of this, can be expressed with a pretty simple slogan, where the slogan is, what it is for X to be more conscious than Y is for X to have more of whatever consciousness is than Y. And this slogan, you might think of as following from a more general principle. What it is for X to have more of any property than Y is for X to have more of whatever that property is than Y. What it is for X to be more massive than Y is for X to have more of whatever mass is than Y. But I think when we apply this slogan to consciousness, we get some insight into what it would take for consciousness to come in degrees. And look, there's a lot of stuff that I'm talking about in this talk, but if there's 2 things that I want people to take from this. So if you forget everything else, just remember the following 2 things. First, questions about whether consciousness comes in degrees are distinct from questions about whether it can be indeterminate whether an entity is conscious. That's the first thing. That's the thing that I was making a case for in discussing the determinacy objection. And then the second is the slogan. What it is for X to be more conscious than Y is for X to have more of whatever consciousness is than Y. Now, we don't know what consciousness is yet. There are substantive and unresolved disputes about the nature of consciousness, so we don't know yet, even with this analysis and the slogan, whether consciousness comes in degrees. But this analysis enables us to know what it would take for consciousness to come in degrees. And I think that's some progress. Now, I'm going to apply this analysis and this slogan to some theories of consciousness in a moment, but let me quickly address one objection. And that's what I'll call the multidimensionality objection. The objection is, if consciousness comes in degrees, then degree of consciousness is a single dimension, but there could be multiple properties that satisfy the difference, dimension, and threshold criteria. So you might think, is that a coherent situation? And in fact, this objection is driving, this is closely related to another one of the major philosophical objections against degrees of consciousness. A lot of people have been skeptical about the idea of ranking creatures with respect to consciousness on a unidimensional scale. So here's my response. That's right, there are multiple properties that might satisfy the analysis, but there's nothing weird or incoherent about that. And that's because many degree properties are multidimensional. So let's consider our old friend size. So here's 2 objects, a line and a circle. And this line is bigger than the circle with respect to height, but smaller than the circle with respect to width. So size is a degree property where there are different dimensions of size. There are different dimensions that determine degree of size. And in some cases, it might be that one thing is neither smaller nor bigger than another thing. Again, consciousness might be like that. It might be that there are multiple factors that determine degree of consciousness, but that wouldn't be an argument against degrees of consciousness. That would just turn out to be, an interesting theoretical situation. Okay, so now for the last part of the talk. I'll apply the analysis that I just developed to some different theories of consciousness. And I'm not going to talk about every theory. In fact, instead, I'm just going to talk about a few cases. I'll talk about 2 classes of theories and then one specific theory. And that's mostly for the purposes of time. I'm just going to focus on some cases that I think are illustrative and that help clarify the notion of degrees of consciousness. So first, let's think about atomism versus holism. Let me start with just some definitions. So let's say that a total experience is an experience that completely characterizes what it's like to be a subject at a time. So your current total experience consists of your visual experience, auditory experience, emotional experience, and so forth. Let's say that atomism is the view that every total experience is composed from a finite number of atomic experiences, where an atomic experience is an experience that isn't composed from any other experiences. And let's say that holism is the view that every total experience is an atomic experience, meaning that total experiences aren't composed from more basic experiences. Now, atomism isn't really like a widely used term in either the philosophy or the science of consciousness nowadays, but there's many theories that can be reasonably construed as atomistic that fall under the definitions that I just gave. So for example, think about, say, a higher order theory. If you're a higher order theorist who thinks that ordinary subjects have many higher order thoughts about many first order mental states, then that would be a version of atomism. Or think about, for example, naive realism. If you're a naive realist who thinks that ordinary subjects are perceptually aware of many external objects rather than just a single complex state of affairs, then that's a version of atomism. Or if, for example, you're a dual aspect monist who thinks that the macro experiences of ordinary subjects are composed from micro experiences of particles, then that's also a version of atomism. So in fact, I think that most theories of consciousness nowadays, most specific theories are atomistic, even if not explicitly, at least somewhat implicitly. And if atomism is true, then consciousness comes in degrees. And that's because it's very natural for atomists to say that if X's total experience is composed from a greater number of atomic experiences than Y's total experience, then X is more conscious than Y. If you check the analysis of degrees of consciousness, you'll see that all the conditions, the threshold, the difference, and the dimension criteria are satisfied in this case. And I mean, you can just see this intuitively or visually. Like if you look at the experience or the subject that's on the left, they have a total experience that's composed of many, many atomic experiences. They're really conscious, wow. But if you look at the subject in the middle, their experience just has a few atomic experiences. And then for the one on the right, their experience is composed from just a single atomic experience. Maybe they're just aware of a single object or representing just a single proposition or have higher order awareness of just a single mental state. They're barely conscious. I think this all makes sense under an atomist framework. So I think that if atomism is true, then we should think that consciousness comes in degrees. Now you might wonder then, does holism, the opposing view, entail that consciousness doesn't come in degrees? And I think we have to be careful here, because if holism is true, then number of atomic experiences isn't a measure of degree of consciousness. But you could be a holist and still think that consciousness comes in degrees if you think that there's some other property that satisfies the analysis that I gave. And in fact, what I'll discuss next will give an example of how even a holist about consciousness might think that consciousness comes in degrees. So here's the second class of theories, what I'll call degreed awareness theories. So according to some theories of consciousness, whenever one is conscious, there's something of which one is aware. This basic idea has been developed in a number of different ways. Some think that the relevant object of awareness is a mental state, and that what it is for a mental state to be conscious is for its subject to be aware of it. Some think that what it is for a subject to be conscious is for that subject to be aware of some external object. So there's different persistifications of this view. But let's call a degreed awareness theory any theory that accepts both that one, consciousness is a matter of stating in a certain kind of awareness relation to a certain kind of object, a mental state or an external object or whatever you want to think. And then two, that the awareness relation comes in degrees. If you think this, then I think that you should think that consciousness comes in degrees, that the degree of awareness of the relevant objects is degree of consciousness. Again, I think that if you check the analysis, then you'll see that that the difference, the threshold, and the dimension criteria are all satisfied for this particular view. And again, I think it's intuitive. It really is the case that consciousness is a matter of standing in an awareness relation to certain objects. And if that awareness relation comes in degrees, then we should think that more awareness means more consciousness, and less awareness means less consciousness. Okay, I'll just talk about one more theory, and that's the global workspace theory. That's a theory that what it is for a mental state to be conscious is for a mental state to be broadcast to a wide range of cognitive systems, like those involved in reporting, planning, reasoning, decision-making, memory, and so forth. So this is one of the major theories of consciousness nowadays. And one reason I wanted to focus on this theory in particular, the other two cases were classes of theories. This is actually a particular theory. One reason I wanted to highlight this is because the global workspace theory is often taken to be a theory that negates the degrees thesis. Some people have argued that if the global workspace theory is true, then consciousness doesn't come in degrees. But if you look at the evidence that's cited, if you look at the papers that discuss this, the evidence only indicates that it's not a matter of degree whether a given mental state is globally broadcast. And that is only evidence for determinacy. It just indicates that it's always determinate whether a mental state is conscious or not. But that leaves open whether the global workspace theory allows for consciousness to come in degrees. And I think to assess that, what we need to do is ask, is there any property that by the lights of the global workspace theory satisfies the analysis of degrees of consciousness that I presented? And I think that this is going to depend in part on the philosophical details. So for example, first, consider a global workspace theory that says that what it is for a mental state to be conscious is for that mental state to be broadcast to a wide range of cognitive systems. That picks out a degree property because wideness of range of cognitive systems can be more or less. So on this view, it's natural to think that if one mental state is broadcast to a very wide range of cognitive systems, reporting, planning, reasoning, decision-making, and memory, and even more, then that mental state is more conscious than a mental state that's broadcast only to, say, reporting and planning. So this would be a version of the global workspace theory that I think naturally entails that consciousness comes in degrees. On the other hand, let's say that you're a global workspace theorist who says that what it is for a mental state to be conscious is for that mental state to be in working memory. Then you might think, well, it's not clear that a mental state can be more in working memory than another mental state. But then on the other hand, even on this view, you could still think that a subject with more contents in working memory is more conscious than a subject with fewer contents in working memory. So I think that whether the global workspace theory entails that consciousness comes in degrees is going to depend on the details, but at least on some of the most natural ways of thinking about the global workspace theory, it does seem that we should think that consciousness comes in degrees. And this brings me to a more general point. To confirm the degrees thesis, what we have to do is show that some property satisfies the analysis of degrees of consciousness. To falsify the degrees thesis, you have to show that no property satisfies the analysis. And in this context, it's easier to demonstrate an existential claim than to demonstrate a universal negation. So look, I didn't talk about every theory of consciousness. I just talked about a few classes. But I think from this brief discussion even, it's natural to think that most theories of consciousness are going to have some property that satisfies the analysis. And given that, I think we should think that it's probably the case that consciousness comes in degrees. That given that most theories are going to entail this, it's reasonable to think that consciousness will come in degrees. And in light of that, I think that maybe the most interesting question isn't whether consciousness comes in degrees. I think it probably does. But instead, which degree properties of consciousness count as degrees of consciousness? That's something that we don't know yet. That's something that we won't know until we have a more sophisticated theory of consciousness that has greater consensus. But now we know how we might find out that answer. Now we have an analysis that enables us to identify what properties count as degree of consciousness. Okay, so let me wrap up by just returning to these claims that I mentioned at the beginning. I said that one perspective on degrees of consciousness takes claims like the ones here as obvious datums. And I've argued that I don't think that's right. I think that none of these claims are obvious. Instead, I think that we should treat these claims as interesting hypotheses that can be either confirmed or falsified. So instead of taking these as basic data points, I think we should treat these as questions that we can ask, that we can investigate. So if we ask, is a human more conscious than a fish? Or is a psychedelic experience more conscious than a sober experience? I mean, I think that the answer is maybe yes, maybe no. It's going to depend on which theory of consciousness is correct. But what I've done here in this talk is to develop an analysis of degrees of consciousness that tells us, here's what it would take to show that the answer is yes. Here's what it would take to show that the answer is no. So given that, I think then all we need to do is figure out which theory of consciousness is correct, and we can figure out which of these claims are true. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Andrew. Great talk, as always. I'm very close personally to start believing that consciousness comes in degrees. I'm not entirely convinced yet, but you can maybe convince me over the next years. We'll see. So it's time for questions. So you can just raise your hand using the chat or however it's organized on your device. So I can start with a small question while we wait for people to think through their questions. So since I'm an empiricist, my question's kind of different from your questions. And earlier today, we talked a bit about this VADA procedure where you anesthetize half the brain. So basically what you can see is that when you ask people what they experienced during this procedure when half the brain is anesthetized, is that they report, no, there's no difference. They just don't experience anything happening to their consciousness in some way. Because basically when one half of one hemisphere is anesthetized, the part that is responsible for knowing that that part is gone is in the anesthetized hemisphere. And so this kind of observation leads me to question, how much can we investigate whether consciousness comes in degrees? Because it's this subjective phenomena, but when you ask people, and if they are in some reduced conscious state, if that actually exists, they would not necessarily be aware that they are reduced. Or when they wake up from this reduced state, they would not be aware that they was in a reduced state. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts about that? It's kind of different from your overall goal of this, but it kind of touches into this, at least determining which theory of consciousness is correct, how to identify features that might come in degrees and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good and interesting question. And I think part of what you're pointing to is that it's not at all straightforward how we would empirically investigate whether consciousness comes in degrees. And I think that's right. Although I think that might just be due to the more general fact that it's not at all empirically straightforward to investigate consciousness in general, not just degrees of consciousness or whether it comes in degrees, but any aspect of consciousness. So, I mean, I think that in order to do empirical investigation at all, we have to make certain assumptions about the functions of consciousness or the kinds of behaviors that would be produced by different kinds of conscious states. And maybe part of what you're thinking is that you would think that if consciousness does come in degrees, then two different subjects that have vastly different degrees of consciousness would behave in different ways, would at least report, give different reports on their experience. And I think that's plausible. But I think that at the same time, whenever we're assessing a theory of consciousness, I guess I'm inclined to think that we have to look at things holistically. Like we always have to ask what are exactly the assumptions that are being made that enable us to investigate consciousness empirically in the first place. Like what exactly is the assumption here in this particular case involving anesthesia and half the brain being anesthetized and the verbal reports of the patients? What exactly is the prediction about how the behavior would be different if consciousness does come in degrees versus if it doesn't? So then it seems to me like, it might just depend on the details in that case. I mean, I think it's also not entirely obvious that if consciousness does come in degrees, then we should necessarily think that that particular case involves a reduction in degrees of consciousness. That also seems to me like it's going to be something that might depend on the particular theory. So, this is a sort of very general answer, but I guess in essence, my inclination is to think that we have to look carefully at the details in this particular case, and there's not really any obvious thing to say a priori from the armchair.
Thanks. So I see no raised hands here. So just in case people are not there is a raised hand. Perfect. So this is Atle Søvik. Do you want to present your case verbally?
Yes, I can do that. So thanks for the talk. My question was, this determinacy objection, it's possible to interpret it as saying that there are different aspects of or features of consciousness that comes in degrees, but there's one important feature, namely subjectivity or first-person perspective, that does not come in degrees. So if the objection is interpreted like that, would you agree then that subjectivity or first-person perspective does not come in degrees? Or would you argue also against that and say, well, maybe subjectivity or the first-person perspective also comes in degrees?
Well, again, I think that what we have to do is make sure we're clear on what is meant by the claim that subjectivity or the first-person perspective comes in degrees. So I think that one interpretation of that remark might be that there can be borderline cases of subjectivity or having a first-person perspective. But then I think that's a question about whether being conscious comes in degrees rather than consciousness comes in degrees. So it's more analogous to the question of whether having mass comes in degrees rather than whether mass comes in degrees. If we're focused on that question, my inclination is to think that the answer is no, that it's never a matter of degree whether an entity is conscious or not. So I think that being conscious is not something that comes in degrees. But then the main point that I wanted to make in discussing the determinacy objection is that you could agree on that. You could think that for any given entity, there's always a fact of the matter about whether it has a first-person point of view or not, while also thinking that consciousness comes in degrees, and that some creatures are more conscious than others.
If I'm allowed to...
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, because I meant also that it seemed hard to make sense of subjectivity itself coming in degrees. It doesn't seem like there's a phenomenal difference between being subjective to different degrees. So it was meant then to be an objection in both senses. But
right. So okay. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that there's no sense at all in which subjectivity comes in degrees. So it's not just that there are no borderline cases of consciousness, but also it's false to say that some creatures are more conscious than other creatures. And am I getting you right?
Or more subjective than others, or having more first-person perspective than others. It doesn't seem like there's a phenomenal difference you can point to, which you could with intensity and all these other aspects. It seems easy to describe a difference, but I can't see how you can describe a difference between being more subjective or having more first-person perspective.
So let me say two things there. One is that I think we have to be very careful about how we formulate things here, because if we're asking, can one creature have more of a first-person perspective than another creature? Then that seems to me like it's a priori, it's like just conceptually entailed that the answer is no. I don't think it's grammatical to say that one creature has more of a subjective perspective than another creature. But then I think that when we're asking this question, we're concerned with the property being conscious rather than the property consciousness. So in the same way that it doesn't make sense to say that one entity has mass more than another entity has mass, I think that we can't say that one entity has a subjective perspective more than another entity has a subjective perspective. But that's maybe sort of kind of a verbal nitpick. I think that maybe the more important thing behind your thought is that maybe there's just not any way of satisfying what I call the dimension criteria. That like there's no aspect of phenomenology that we can track when people say that some creatures are more conscious than other creatures. And I mean, I agree that if we're just introspecting, it's not really obvious what that might be. That's part of why I myself am not entirely certain that consciousness comes in degrees. I'm just sort of looking at the different theories and saying, look, if you think about what it is for consciousness to come in degrees and what these theories say, then we should think this. But I'm not really sure what exactly the subjective aspect would be. I think that if the theories that we're looking at are true, for example, if the version of atomism is true, then there's going to be some subjective dimension of experience that corresponds to degree of consciousness. But I think that we're currently at like a stage of developing our theories of consciousness where we just don't really know how to map the structures of these theories to the structures of our phenomenology yet. So basically, I'm in some ways sympathetic to the thought you're expressing that it's not entirely obvious what the relevant dimension of consciousness is when people talk about degrees of consciousness.
Thanks.
Johan, you also raised your hand.
Yes, there was an interesting thing in the chat here that this talk, thank you, by the way, Andrew, for a very nice talk. Of course, some people may feel that this is fairly technical, philosophical in some sense, but I think you have shown that this is really important also for avoiding misunderstandings, that we are analyzing this in the way that you are doing. That's also relevant also for people doing sort of empirical conscious research, that we are clear about our concepts, just like it has been in the history of science for mass versus weight and so on. So but this guy calls this an extreme sport, but I think it's also very interesting to see how philosophers work these days, you know, to clarify concepts and the usefulness of this. There's one little thing in the last slide you had where you talked about whether a strong, intense pain is more conscious than the mild pain, and the vague person more conscious than drowsy. I think you're using more conscious in a slightly different meaning in those two cases, right? Because I would say that a person can be conscious, but the pain is a sort of a quality of consciousness, but a qualia, but it's not conscious in itself, of course, in the same way as a person is. But so what you mean, of course, in those cases, it's not problematic, because what you mean is that there will be a greater degree or amount or consciousness when you have a strong pain and a weak pain, and when you have and so on. Right? So it's a convergence on that, but you could be picky about the slightly different meaning of the word. Would you agree with that, or?
I mostly agree, but so this is the second slide of the talk, and I said that if the answer is yes to whether consciousness comes in degrees, then that means that some creatures or mental states are more conscious than other creatures or mental states. So these examples of different claims that people make, the first three are ascribing consciousness to creatures or to subjects, and the second three are ascribing consciousness to mental states or experiences.
Yeah, sorry, you see, I missed the first part of your talk because I was giving a talk myself in the course, and it went over time a little bit, so I missed those first slides. Okay, that clears it up. Thanks a lot.
All right, we have a question in the chat regarding lucid dreaming. Since I see no raised hand, I assume this is, I can present it on behalf of the person. So the question is, I can experience in lucid dreaming a very distinct difference between being aware that I'm dreaming versus when I'm not. So this is not specifically a question, but if I'm allowed to extend the message here, then there is, in some cases, we can have experiences that we are aware of having versus experiences that we are not aware of having, like a sort of meta-awareness, if you will. So could this be a candidate for a degreed consciousness, or a feature or phi of property that can be used as a degree of consciousness?
So what's the candidate exactly?
Being more or less aware of your experiences. So for example, dreaming versus lucid dreaming is a typical case which one can maybe experience oneself.
Yeah, so I mean, that sounds to me like one way of developing that idea might be to think of that along the lines of what I was calling degreed awareness theories. So as I said, some people think that what consciousness is awareness of something, maybe a mental state, or maybe some people think that it's awareness of an external object. Let's say a mental state here. So if what consciousness is awareness of some kind of mental state, and that let's suppose that when you're lucid dreaming, that awareness is greater in degree than when you're just normal dreaming, then I think that would entail that in lucid dreaming, one is more conscious than in normal dreaming. The question then is whether this theory is true in the first place, whether a degreed awareness theory is true in the first place. And then I think we would get to, some more general questions in the philosophy and the science of consciousness, for example, whether, say, a higher order theory of consciousness is true or not, and whether that would be applicable in cases of lucid dreaming or not. So I think that's at least how I would be inclined to think about this particular case.
All right. Johan, you have your hand raised still, or do you just forgot to lower it?
I forgot to remove it, sorry.
Okay, great, thanks. Sebastian?
I have a question about why it matters, where it might matter whether consciousness comes in degrees. So with regard to determinacy, I think there are some big questions where that issue matters. Like, for example, it's much easier, or it would be much easier to see how consciousness arises in the history of evolution if we could make sense of consciousness, there being borderline cases. Also, it would matter for moral questions. If there are some creatures that are borderline cases, then we say, well, for those creatures, we're not sure whether, for example, they have a moral status, that they matter morally. But what does it matter for whether consciousness comes in degrees now they have distinguished these things? Why care about that question? Is that more interesting than just asking about these specific dimensions of consciousness, whether they come in degrees, like the vivacity and so on? What is it really, what does it matter for?
Okay, let me first give a cheeky answer and then a real answer. So the cheeky answer is, here's like a ton of articles, and this is just a small sample of in consciousness research where people are appealing to the idea of degrees of consciousness. So it matters in the sense that we care about whether these articles are, really tracking some kind of truth and making progress, or whether they're just fundamentally confused. So that's one thing. But I think more importantly, I think there's various other ways, various substantive ways in which this matters. So one thing is, it might matter for moral issues. For example, there's some debate about whether consciousness is intrinsically valuable. If it is intrinsically valuable, then it's natural to think that a greater degree of consciousness is more intrinsically valuable. I don't think that consciousness is intrinsically valuable myself, but if you did, then it would have those sorts of implications. Also, I think more importantly, I think it has implications for both the philosophy and the science of consciousness. So for example, if we're interested in understanding how conscious experiences are structured, then if it is the case that consciousness comes in degrees, then that's going to be presumably a basic structural feature of experience, and we should be trying to construct models of experience that allow for that degreed structure rather than models that are just binary. And then for the science of consciousness, I mean, one of the main things that people want to do is construct empirical measures of consciousness that tell us when a creature is conscious versus not, or when a mental state is conscious versus not. And if we can be justified in thinking that consciousness comes in degrees, then we can get a whole lot of traction by using a graded measure than a binary measure. I mean, the kind of data that we would get is would be a lot more structured. We would get ordinal data rather than just like binary data. So, I mean, I think that it'll have implications there too. Whereas on the other hand, if you thought that the idea of consciousness is just, of degrees of consciousness is just fundamentally confused, then empirical measures that appeal to that are graded would themselves be theoretically or methodologically flawed. So we'd have to throw away some of them. So, I mean, I think those are just two examples, but those seem to me to be fairly fundamental, issues. One is how do we measure and empirically detect consciousness, and another is how should we think about the structure of consciousness?
Thank you.
All right, Ole Berg.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the lecture. It was fascinating to follow. And I was wondering, what is the relationship between your sort of very conceptual analysis and the empirical research that is done on consciousness? To which extent, for example, does the empirical research that is going on inform your analysis? And to what extent does your analysis have implications for empirical research? Thank you.
Well, in terms of whether the empirical research informs my analysis, I mean, part of why I got interested in this is because many scientific papers on consciousness appeal to the idea of degrees of consciousness. So one thing I was wondering is, does this make sense? Is this something that is philosophically defensible? And, as I said, some philosophers have argued that, no, it doesn't make sense. And I thought, actually, it does make sense, or at least it's coherent. So in that sense, it's not like empirical results are informing the content that is here, but that's because this is largely theoretical work, and it's theoretical work that is connected to the empirical issues and that bears on some already existing empirical papers. And so in that sense, it's connected. And I do think that this has applications to empirical investigations of consciousness. I mean, maybe one thing that's worth saying here is that I don't really think of there being any sharp cutoff between any sharp divide between empirical and theoretical work. It seems to me like all empirical work is, partially theoretical, and maybe not all theoretical work is empirical, but certainly if you're doing any kind of empirical work on consciousness, you'll have to be thinking about, what do I mean by consciousness? What kinds of assumptions are being made? And given that a good amount of empirical work is appealing to the idea of degrees of consciousness, I think it's worth asking, how exactly should we understand this notion? Does it make sense? And which other concepts is this sometimes confused with? So that's sort of the application. And I mean, I guess one other way of putting this is that one way that you could see this particular work is that there's both philosophers and scientists that appeal to the idea of degrees of consciousness. And then there's a bunch of philosophers who have said that you guys are all confused. This doesn't make any sense. And I actually think that those philosophers have been somewhat confused. And it's okay to appeal to degrees of consciousness. I think it's worth thinking about these issues because it is the case that oftentimes scientists are conflating determinacy and degrees. Philosophers are doing that as well. So I think that, understanding these sorts of distinctions can bring conceptual clarity to the empirical work. And then I guess the very last thing I'll say is that one of the main ideas in this talk has been that we can't actually settle whether consciousness comes in degrees with any simple philosophical argument. Instead, I think that we have to look at our best theories of consciousness, and that's going to partially depend on doing the relevant empirical research. So What I've been taking myself to do is to clarify what the question is and what the idea of degrees of consciousness is in the first place, and what it would actually take to show that consciousness does or doesn't come in degrees. But then after that, there's the like much harder task of actually figuring out whether it in fact does come in degrees or not.
Thank you.
All right, Johan?
Yeah, I just want to add that I said I think this kind of analysis is very useful also for empirical research, but would you also agree, Andrew, that this is not only about, of course, consciousness itself, how its properties is, but it's very much also about our way of thinking, our logic, our intuition, our way of using language, in order to tidy up those aspects, in order to be able to use those as tools when they do research on consciousness and empirical research. So this is all, but it's all entangled, especially in the field of consciousness research, because consciousness is so subjective, so it's very closely tied to our way of thinking about it and our intuitions, of course. And of course, our intuitions are part of our consciousness also. So I think this is also, in a way, getting into the meta problem of consciousness. Why is consciousness such a special problem? Why is it so hard to think about and so on? So would you agree with that, or?
I would agree with most of that. The only thing I have pause on is whether there are connections to the meta problem. So the meta problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why there's a problem of consciousness in the first place, and why we find consciousness puzzling for those that haven't heard of this in the audience. I mean, I haven't thought about whether this has connections to the meta problem of consciousness or not, but it's not obvious to me what the connections would be. But I mean, I do very much agree with you that this talk is principally about clarifying the concept of consciousness and also the concept of degrees and determinacy. Yeah, I think in that respect, that's what the utility of this is supposed to be. I don't think that I'm really making any substantive claims about the nature of consciousness itself, in part because, I mean, part of what I'm saying here is that we don't know whether consciousness comes in degrees. But if you just say, let's say that you apportion your credence across the different theories of consciousness that exist today equally, so you grant equal credence in like every theory of consciousness, then I think that you should think that consciousness probably comes in degrees, because I think that most theories of consciousness suggest that it does. So in that sense, that's kind of substantive, but that's just applying the analysis to different theories of consciousness again. But anyway, if you're more, if what you had in mind is just that, this kind of work can help us clarify our thinking about consciousness, and that's useful for both philosophers and scientists, then I agree with that. That's what I've been hoping to do in this talk.
All right, we have two questions in the chat, or one question. I will kind of combine them a bit. So, so I guess this question is more about what your intuition would tell you, because as you stated many times, we don't know yet. But there are certain organisms like coral reefs, for example, that kind of has like a big, broad network of processing inputs in a way, not necessarily specific. Or you have animals with thousands of eyes, like insects. Or you can imagine certain people who experience things that are unavailable to most of us, whether that comes from belief or some perceived extrasensory perception or whatnot. So what would kind of your intuition tell you about like more or less sensory input or more or less senses in this case?
Right, good. So that's, I think, an interesting question. Let's think about this kind of case. So let's compare, let's make it a little bit clearer and less controversial. So let's compare, say, like a human and let's say like a slug. Suppose that slugs are conscious. Or if you don't think slugs are conscious, maybe a fish. So you're asking, what is my intuition in this case? My intuition is that it would be true to say that the human is more conscious. But what I want to emphasize here is, given what I've said in this talk, I think that the way we should think about this is that, or the way that we should cash out that claim is that or at least the way that I would want to cash out that claim, is that we don't know exactly what consciousness is yet, but it seems plausible that whatever consciousness is, the human has more of it than the slug does. There's different hypotheses that there might be that we could construct about why the human would be more conscious than the slug, and none of them is obviously true. And, you know, in principle, we could imagine theories that negate this claim. But if we're just appealing to starting hypotheses or intuitions or basic ideas for inquiring about consciousness, I think that's a reasonable idea to appeal to, so long as we recognize that it's not something that we can just take for as given. It's a hypothesis that might turn out to be defeasible.
So just to extend on that, and this kind of brings in the ethical question a bit as well, because our intuition would tell us also that a person with a cortical stroke, for example, in the occipital lobe, and just loses vision or capacity to see, would not be less conscious than a person with an intact cortex, for example, even though they have reduced brain mass and lost a sense, so to speak. So, but our intuition would not say that they are less conscious, but then it becomes a problem of any kind of distinction we make between, say, a slug and a human would just be on a spectrum of cortical strokeness in a way. With enough strokes or enough damage, you would kind of be reduced to a slug in terms of number of neurons that are active. So ethically, it becomes a problem to make a distinction, right?
So a couple of things there. One is that I don't think we necessarily have to assume that cortical complexity or neuronal density or anything in that vicinity is necessarily the right measure of degree of consciousness, if consciousness comes in degrees. So that seems to me to be a substantive assumption that one could push back on. Now, for the example that you were giving of the person who loses vision versus the person who has normal vision, I don't think it's obvious what to say there. You were saying that our intuition is that the person who has lost vision is not less conscious than the person with normal vision. I wonder if maybe the inclination to say that is coming from the use of a different sense of consciousness that maybe has something to do with intelligence or something like that, like certainly, or that has something to do maybe with moral status, if people are thinking that there's the connection there. So certainly we don't want to give less moral status to blind people. And we don't want to say that like blind people are like less intelligent. But then if we're careful and we're making sure that we're talking about phenomenal consciousness, I think that it's not entirely clear. I mean, I think, again, it might depend on the details. And you could also think that, well, maybe there are like minute differences in degree of consciousness between different people, but it's not enough to like really matter or to like be something that we care about from a social perspective. So anyway, I think that's, I want to say those things about that part. And then for the connections to moral status, I think that that's difficult as well. I mean, in ethics, there's controversy over what exactly are the grounds of moral status. I think that probably the most common view is that consciousness is what grounds moral status, but some people think otherwise. But even if we do think that consciousness is what grounds moral status, and even if we also think that consciousness comes in degrees, it's not obvious that degree of consciousness would itself have any kind of moral significance. Maybe as long as you're conscious at all, you have moral status, and that's what matters. And then, you know, we can look at the specific capacities and kinds of experiences that a subject can have, but maybe it might turn out that degree of consciousness itself, even if it exists, is not something that is morally significant. I think that's an interesting question. And that's something we're speculating about. But I think at the same time, it might be something that is somewhat difficult to speculate about, even from the realm of ethical theory, until we have a better conception of what exactly degrees of consciousness would actually be.
Thank you. So even though we are just past the time limit, there are a few questions left. So for those who are interested, just please stick around, as long as it's okay for you, Andrew.
Yep, I'm happy to stick around.
Yeah. So Ole.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. there was one thing I was thinking about, for those who are arguing in favor of the binary theory of consciousness. How do they tackle the sort of consequential questions related to the emergence of consciousness? So in phylogeny and in ontogeny. So, I mean, in evolution, it's harder to imagine how a property can evolve in a binary way, so suddenly appearing. And also in childhood, or so to speak, are there moments of awakening, which I think would be a consequential result if there is a binary property?
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting question. Now, let me first say, just to be clear, if I understood you correctly, this is a puzzle that concerns determinacy, not degrees. So if we think that, if we think about the idea that every entity either is conscious or not, and then we think about the gradual process from like a fetus to a human, or from across the like an evolutionary process, then it seems kind of weird to think like, oh, suddenly a small difference makes a difference to whether an entity is conscious or not. That seems kind of puzzling. And I agree that that's puzzling. I don't think that, well, just to make sure that we're crystal clear, this talk is about a different notion, namely whether some creatures can be more conscious than others. But if we're thinking about this other notion about this puzzle that arises, if we think that it's always determinate whether an entity is conscious or not, that there's always a fact of the matter about whether an entity is conscious or not. I mean, I basically agree that this is something that is puzzling. And I think there's basically two natural options you could take. One is to accept something counterintuitive about consciousness, namely that there can be borderline cases of consciousness, where by borderline case here, we don't just mean a case where we're uncertain of whether a creature is conscious or not, but where there's no fact of the matter about whether a creature is conscious or not. That's the thing that a lot of people have thought, maybe that's not coherent. So this is one of the horns of the dilemma, to say that actually that is coherent. Maybe we don't know how to make sense of it, but we have to think that in some cases, a creature neither is nor is not conscious. The other option is to say that, yeah, it is the case that a very small difference makes the difference between whether something is conscious or not. A very small physical difference that might seem to not, be physically significant, that might not seem to make a difference to any kind of interesting natural kind, marks the boundary between when there's nothing it's like to be a creature versus when there's at least a little bit something it's like to be a creature. I'm wondering if I should say more here. I mean, I guess speaking for myself, I'm inclined to go with the latter route. I think that the concept of consciousness is such that it's always determinate. So I'm skeptical that we can make sense of the idea of indeterminate cases of consciousness where there's no fact of the matter about whether there's something it's like to be an entity. And I guess speaking for myself, I'm inclined to think that this has some implications for how we should think about our theories of consciousness. But I think maybe going into that we'll be going too far down the rabbit hole. But I guess one last thing I'll say is just that I agree that this is very much an interesting issue, and there is some literature on this issue too, and there's some debates amongst philosophers on what we should think about this kind of puzzle.
All right. Next up is Johan.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think we should just remind ourselves that we are likely to be deeply ignorant about these things, about other creatures, and to what extent and in what way they are conscious, because we have this huge extrapolation problem that we have experience of consciousness only from our own extreme case of the most complex, one of the most complex branches that we know in the universe. It's very hard to extrapolate, but then we may get some hints from for instance, we tend to think our intuitions may be quite wrong in many respects. We think tends to think about, for instance, instincts, since they're automatic, that they are sort of not accompanied by feelings or consciousness. Whereas, you know, people have studied this, like Derek Denton in Australia, who had his book about the primordial feelings. He finds that, you know, a thing like thirst, that is an instinctive, the urge to drink when you have too high osmolarity in the blood, that is, of course, very strongly, you know, accompanied by very strong feelings and experience, although it is almost automatic and instinctive. Or you could think of it as almost like a reflex that you don't, it's not accompanied by consciousness. So there may be many misleading ideas from our limited experience as humans. The other thing, yeah, so I think in all these matters, I think we should have to look in the mirror and look at our own limitations as thinking beings, that our own ability to think and to imagine things and so on is very limited. So things that are totally counterintuitive for us may still be true, although we have great difficulty talking about it then, because our language and grammar and logic and the concepts are all built upon the things that were used to be useful for us during evolution to survive in nature, and not fundamental, presumably. Anyway, so that's just my, I don't know if you agree with any of this, but.
I very much agree with the general sentiment. I think that we should generally be wary, especially in scientific investigations or investigations of natural phenomena, of putting too much weight on our pre-theoretical intuitions. Because, I mean, you're absolutely right that, you know, we're like animals that have evolved to have certain kinds of psychological systems, and the psychological systems might not always be truth tracking. And I mean, we already know from like plenty of other cases that the world is way different than what we might have just intuitively thought. Like, look at, like, you know, relativity and quantum mechanics and so forth.
Prime examples. Yeah. And that also shows the importance of experiments, because then theoreticians are really forced by experiment to totally turn around in their ideas about space and time and causality and all that, you know. Yeah. So.
All right. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Here's one. What theories of consciousness would imply that consciousness does not come in degrees? Yeah, what would it take for consciousness to be a binary notion other than holism, as one could be a holist and still believe that consciousness comes in degrees?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's something I talk about a bit in the paper, but I didn't talk about here for purposes of time. And I mean, part of why I am inclined to say that consciousness probably comes in degrees is because I think it's actually kind of hard to think of theories that clearly entail that consciousness doesn't come in degrees. So the example that I use in the paper itself is something, imagine that what it is to be conscious is to have a soul. So this isn't a theory that's taken seriously by philosophers and scientists, but just think about this theory. So suppose that, like, each of us, all of the people in this room, Zoom room have a soul, and we have exactly one soul, and that soul doesn't come in degrees. There's no relevant discrete structure there. So I think that would be a theory where consciousness doesn't come in degrees. At least I don't see any obvious property that would satisfy the analysis. That's just one clear example. You know, that's not a theory that's taken seriously by people nowadays, so it's I don't think it really has much implication for contemporary debates. I mean, I guess if we want like a more a theory that's more likely to be defended by contemporary philosophers and scientists, then we could think of a version of holism that doesn't accept degreed awareness. So I was saying that if you're a holist and you accept degreed awareness, then you might still think that consciousness comes in degrees. But suppose that you think that holism is true. Each of us has exactly one fundamental experience, and it doesn't have this act-object structure. So it doesn't involve awareness of anything. It's just this single unary thing. I mean, that's kind of like the soul theory in structure, even if not in terms of the metaphysics. And I think that that might be a version of a view where consciousness doesn't come in degrees. And I think, you know, that's an interesting theory that some people might defend. It's not the kind of theory that most, it doesn't really fit with most contemporary theories of consciousness. Like most people think in atomistic terms, and oftentimes people think in these awareness terms where the idea is that consciousness involves awareness of something. But that might be one example of a more normal theory that negates the degrees thesis.
All right, so the next question is, does your definition of consciousness presuppose some content of consciousness, or can consciousness be contentless, and how?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I don't really have an opinion there. I mean, I know there's some interesting discussions in the connected to mindfulness and Buddhism and meditation that relate to this. I guess all I have to say there is that I think that's an interesting question, but I don't really have any view.
It's difficult to have a view on everything. Okay, there's more questions here in the chat. So this is regarding self-consciousness. Can an entity that is not self-conscious have consciousness? I guess that depends a bit on the definition, but what would be your thoughts?
I think on the most natural ways of understanding self-consciousness and consciousness, where consciousness is phenomenal consciousness, then the answer is almost certainly yes. I mean, if self-consciousness means something like having beliefs about oneself or having some sorts of, you know, cognitive mechanisms that represent oneself, then that's a fairly sophisticated cognitive mechanism. For example, if we take something like recognition of oneself in a mirror as a test for self-consciousness, then it seems very plausible that not all creatures that are phenomenally conscious, where there's something it's like to be the creature, have that feature. Of being able to recognize themselves in the mirror or being able to represent themselves. There's
just so I understood you correctly, you said that some entities that can recognize themselves in the mirror are not necessarily phenomenally conscious.
No, I was saying the converse, that it's very plausible that some entities that are phenomenally conscious would not be able to recognize themselves in a mirror. Maybe I misspoke there, but that's what I meant to be saying. No, I mean, I think there's a question of what exactly is meant by self-consciousness here, though. And I think there's other ways of understanding the notion of self-consciousness that are more broad, but also make it more plausible that there's a connection between self-consciousness and consciousness. So, for example, Uriah Kriegel is a philosopher who thinks that who holds what's called a reflexive theory of consciousness. He thinks that all consciousness involves self-representation, meaning that conscious states are those that represent themselves. And maybe that would qualify as a version of like self-consciousness. So that's a theory that some people take seriously and that's defended. But if self-consciousness means what most psychologists mean by self-consciousness, where it's a more sophisticated cognitive capacity, then I think we should separate that from phenomenal consciousness.
So one last question from the chat, and then Johan, and then I have one tiny question to the end, and then I think we'll call it a day. So for a neuropsychologist, it seems quite evident empirically that consciousness, or at least attention or capacity for awareness, has degrees. How do you separate consciousness from degrees of attention or awareness of external or internal events?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question and interesting question. I agree that it's very plausible that attention comes in degrees. There's controversy over the relationship between consciousness and attention. And there's a big debate going on now in philosophy and cognitive science about whether there can be phenomenal consciousness without attention. Speaking for myself, I don't really have a view on that debate. I'm just kind of agnostic there. I guess to connect this to the topic of this talk, I think one view that I think is reasonable and defensible is that what it is to be conscious is for some mental state to occupy attention. So if we think of attention as being distributed over a set of mental states, then one theory of consciousness is that the conscious mental states are all and only the mental states that that attention is just distributed over. So that is making a connection between the nature of consciousness and attention. And if that kind of theory is true, and assuming that attention does in fact come in degrees, I think it would be natural then to say that consciousness comes in degrees. So if what it is to be conscious is to be the object, for a mental state to be conscious is to be the object of attention, and attention, you know, comes in greater or lesser extents, then I think that we should think that consciousness comes in greater or lesser extents. That's basically a version of what I was calling a degreed awareness theory, where consciousness involves this awareness of some kind of object. But again, to back up, I agree with you that this attention is an interesting phenomenon, and it's interesting. It seems to have some important connection to consciousness, but it's not very obvious. And I think there's open theoretical issues about what exactly that relationship is.
Johan?
Just a very short remark about self-consciousness. I mean, I think that's very much separate from phenomenological consciousness, because you can imagine you know, a computer or a robot that can of course recognize itself and a lot of information about itself without having any qualia or any consciousness in our sense of the word, right? So I think that's very separate. A little remark about from biology, insects don't actually have thousands of eyes in the sense that because just that the pixels, you know, they are in separate, separate unit themselves. So yeah, that's corresponding to our retina. Anyway, thanks a lot. It was great. Yeah.
So I'll finish up with a question regarding a very popular topic, at least in the mainstream media, and it's regarding panpsychism. But it's I was thinking directed to one of your slides where you had these four: minimalism, maximalism, medialism, and universalism. So as far as I understood the universal claim as charge, would panpsychism be an example where consciousness is universal in this sense? That everything is conscious and there's no unconsciousness and there's no negative, of course. So I would assume the answer is no, but I would hear your thoughts about this, and also panpsychism in general in relation to this talk, because you didn't mention panpsychism in your manuscript as far as I can see.
Right. So for the question about this slide, the answer is no. The sense in which consciousness is universal according to panpsychism is just a different sense of universal than what I'm talking about here. So on this slide, what I'm asking is, what is the relationship between degrees of some property and having or being that property? So basically, what's the threshold for counting as being an F? And I went through this very quickly, but the idea behind what I was calling a universal property is not that the property is instantiated everywhere, but instead that something counts as having that property just in case it has any value, any degree of that property. So I mean, charge is a good example here. Charge is not everywhere. I mean, it's in a lot of places, but not, well, actually, sorry, maybe that's not a good example. I guess charge is everywhere. But the point about charge is just that anything that has either a positive, negative, or zero value of charge is something that has charge. So you could imagine that, let's say only certain objects have charge, like only certain regions of the universe have charge. Then charge would still be a universal property in the sense that I'm talking about here, because it would still be the case that so long as something has a positive, negative, or zero value of charge, any value of charge, then it counts as having charge. But now let's talk about the panpsychism stuff. So you're asking what is the connection between this and panpsychism? I did actually mention panpsychism in the paper itself, but under a different name. I called it dual aspect monism, but it's basically the same thing. If you're the most common version of panpsychism is a view that takes fundamental entities to be conscious, and that takes our own experiences to be built out of the experiences of those fundamental entities. So this kind of panpsychism takes consciousness to just be a basic feature of the universe in a naturalistic way, in the same way as like charge or mass and so forth, and thinks that there are systematic ways in which the experiences of the fundamental things combine to yield the experiences of the non-fundamental things. So what I was just describing is what's sometimes called micro panpsychism. That's a bottom-up version where the fundamental stuff is the small stuff, like particles. And if you're a micropsychist, then you're an atomist in the sense that I was talking about, because you think that our experiences, the experiences that we have, are made out of are ultimately made out of the experiences of fundamental particles. Maybe many of them, and they have to combine sophisticated ways, but in the same way that like our brains are made out of fundamental particles, our experiences associated with our brains are made out of the experiences associated with the fundamental particles. So basically, if you endorse the most common version of panpsychism, then you should think that consciousness comes in degrees, because that version of panpsychism is a version of atomism, and atomism entails that consciousness comes in degrees. I think that's the most straightforward connection. And I mean, I think it's very natural for panpsychists to say, yeah, some things are more conscious than others. Humans are more conscious than fundamental particles, as well as, you know, slugs and so forth.
All right, thank you. I have more questions, but I will think we can take that another time. So I would like to thank the remainder of our guests for attending us so far. And I will, of course, thank Andrew for holding this excellent presentation and all the questions that came in. There are some claps in the chat and some positive remarks in the chat as well. So little clap for Andrew. And
thank you all for attending. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so if there's any follow-up questions, I put my email in the chat and I can forward them if there's anything specific that comes along. So with that, have a good weekend, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thanks, everyone.